This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I have Carl Wiederquist. He is a political philosopher at Georgetown University, and we'll be discussing the book that he wrote with Grant S. McCall called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy, and the conversation will begin when we return. Political philosopher Carl Wiederquist is back. I had him on a show on UBI a few months ago. This time we'll be talking about a book he co-wrote called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. But before we get into that, I'd like to give him a few minutes just to give a little bit of background about himself. So welcome back, Carl. If you could, for people watching this for the first time, give a little background about yourself.
Sure. I am both an economist and a philosopher. I have it was a bit of a career changer because I'm interested in how the economy works and what is a just economy. So I'm looking at the political philosophy of it. I'm at Georgetown University's campus in Qatar in the Middle East, where I've been for about 10 years. I'm working there as a philosopher, and I'm doing a lot of research on a number of topics. Basic income is a big topic with me, but also some very basic philosophy. I found myself in this book then looking into anthropological evidence to look at theories that philosophers are spouting right now, and whether they're consistent or not with evidence.
Well, let's start off with the title of the book. What does the title of the book? How does it? Sort of presage what the book is about, because it's an interesting title.
Oh, you know that you hear very often people say, well, back in the Stone Age, things were like this, and we evolved to be like this, and then everything changed, whether we created civilization, or we created farming, or we created whatever else. Everything changed, and that's why we have these problems today. That's why we're maladjusted to this issue today. People spout a lot of talk like that, and they seldom put forth evidence for what it is. And reading in modern political theories, I found that there are a lot of claims floating around that are like this. They make claims about the prehistory, or about our relationship as modern people to prehistory, and they'll seldom back that up with any evidence whatsoever. Maybe some a priori reasoning, but no actual evidence, and they'll just assume everybody's going to accept this is true. There are a lot of books now that are starting to come out that are debunking some of these ideas. These are the prehistoric myths that I'm talking about. Another word for them is paleo-fantasy. If that word had been coined when we started writing the book, maybe we'd call them paleo-fantasies. But there's a book called Paleo-Fantasy, which is debunking some of these claims. There's another book, The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott is along these lines, and Death, the First 1,000 Years by David Graeber is along these lines. But in our book, we're addressing claims related to one big idea that is embedded both in the most common contemporary justification for the state and the most common contemporary justification for private property. Now, both of these usually involve what is called a Lockean proviso, is that everybody's got to be, you can impose an institution on people, but only if it doesn't harm people. So you can, in terms of appropriation, in terms of having private property, it's okay to have private property and appropriate it as long as everyone is better off. So if people living in a private property society, even the poorest people, are better off than people were in prehistory, then the private system is justified, even though we have great unequal control. You would think normally, that property should be divided equally. If we're going to divide, at least the resources should be divided equally. But some people control great amounts of resources, and some people none. And the argument for this usually involves both they did something to appropriate it, and because, well, everybody's better off, even the poor are better off. And also there's justification of the state for that. The argument about the Lockean proviso goes back to John Locke in the late 1600s, but 50 years earlier, Thomas Hobbes was making a similar argument for the state. He wasn't saying the state was appropriated, but that we need a state because everyone is so terribly poor off in prehistory when there was no state. There was lots of violence, there was lots of poverty, and we needed a state to establish order to get rid of that. And now, when we have a state, everybody is better off than they would be in the state of nature, and therefore the state is justified. And on similar grounds, at least one of the grounds that property is created, property is also justified. And this belief that Hobbes said and Locke said, and many, many philosophers, politicians, economists, political theorists, and many other people have repeated these claims for 350 years, that they didn't notice that neither Hobbes nor Locke or really any of their successors had actually researched this. How do we know that people are better off now than they were or would be in a society that had no government, or a society that had no privatized land and resources? And it turns out what we have here is a factoid. A factoid is defined as something that is believed. It gets its credibility just by how often it's repeated, but not by the evidence for it. It was really easy for Locke and Hobbes to think, oh, the lowliest civilized man is going to be better off than any of those naked savages. Certainly those people, certainly we're all better off in state society. But now that we realize, well, that belief about civilized man being better than naked savages, and that there really were people you would call naked savages, is now, that belief is entirely discredited. But yet this belief that everybody in state society or everybody in a private property rights society is better off than everybody in states without, in societies without these institutions, then that belief still goes on. People still believe that, even though the only evidence for it just came from prejudice, and the prejudice was motivated by European colonial powers that wanted to think they were better than everybody else and take them off. So what we do in this book is we look at these theories. We look at Hobbesian social contract theory justifying the state. We look at Lockean private property rights theory and using this a proviso as one of the things that justifies property. Then we look at 300 years of people following Hobbes and Locke. We look at philosophers, economists, political theorists, other people over the last 300 years or more. You find that consistently people are repeating this as if it's a proven fact without putting evidence for it. So we show that it's still being used in the 20 teens. You still have people relying on their justification of the state or their justification of private property by making this claim and not backing it up. There's hundreds of years of history of people doing this that we show is happening. Then we take a few chapters to really look at the anthropological evidence. So I'm a philosopher. My co-author, Grant S. McCall, is an anthropologist. And so it's not just a philosopher dabbling in anthropology or an anthropologist dabbling in philosophy, but it's the two of us together, bringing our specialized knowledge from both fields to bring in this up. So we look at a wide range of anthropological sources, look at how people live in states, in societies that don't have a state government and don't have privatized natural resources, and you will find that people in these societies do not live well. But they live in some ways better than the poorest people among us. They don't have to eat out of dumpsters. They are in some ways healthier. They tend to live shorter, but they're invulnerable to many diseases that people face in the world that can actually shorten your life more than that. And they're much freer than people in societies today. They have at least the least well-off people. So we're not saying that no one's better off, and we're not saying that the average person isn't better. Today, the average person is better off. Actually, when Locke and Hobbes were saying this, probably the average person was actually worse off. But Today, it's probably true that the average person is better off, but the claim that they're making is that everyone is better off, not the average. And there are some people who are clearly harmed by the establishment of the private property rights system and the state government and the state governing system. Now, so we establish this with good evidence, looking at the welfare people in state societies and the welfare people in non-state societies. Then we look at the implications of these theories. And the implications for these theories, we have a whole chapter on it, but it can really be summed up. And it can really be summed up in about 4 words. Treat disadvantaged people better. We treat disadvantaged people really poorly, and we use this as an excuse. We use but you're all better off because the property rights system is good for you. The state system is good for you. We say that, and we believe it too. And we don't have the facts to back it up, and it is a false belief.
Well, let me start from the beginning, not of the book, but of human society. What is the general rationale for a state? To me, and from a lot of people that I know and what I've read, the state exists basically to provide things that the individual cannot provide for themselves, such as a militia, a police force, certain things that a functioning water system, and later on, electricity and things like that. Can those things be provided in a stateless society? And what is the function of the state then?
Well, when I'm talking about stateless societies, I'm talking about indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And this myth, this paleo fantasy, is used not only as an excuse to treat disadvantaged people in our own societies worse, but it's also an excuse to treat indigenous people worse. This is still going on as the Amazon today, when Bolsonaro if I'm pronouncing that right, in Brazil is threatening to commit genocide against them and force them to incorporate. Now, the indigenous people of the Amazon, the few who remain. Now, so I'm talking about people living as nomadic hunter-gatherers and people living as, say, Swidden agriculturalists, which is mean they cut down the trees, burn some stuff, and stay there for a few years, and then move on again. These are the type of stateless societies that I'm looking at. Now, most of us wouldn't want to live in such a society, but some of us actually couldn't afford not to. If your prospect is to be the lowliest worker in a sweatshop in Brazil, or be somebody who lives in a stateless community in the Amazon that is claimed by Brazil, but not all of it is really controlled by Brazil, your life prospects of having a good, fulfilling life and lots of happy communing with your neighbors and friends would be better in that. So it's something about the least advantage of us. It's not really about providing all of these things in an anarchist setting. Now, there are anarchist theorists who argue that it is possible to provide the things you're talking about, the sewage system and protection and things like that, in a large-scale stateless society. That's what we're trying to do in this book. We're trying to do in this book, if you're doing what you promised when you established this state system and this property rights system, you promised it was going to be good for everyone, and it's actually not good for the poorest among us. You got to make good on that promise. You made that promise 350 years ago. It's time our state system made good on that promise.
But isn't a stateless society dependent upon a low population? For example, if you get to Babylonia and China and India, these ancient societies that rose up, didn't the necessity of a state kind of being arise due to population? I mean, you can't have nomadic people when you have hundreds of thousands of people. If you have just a few hundred, you can.
Yes, that's true. But having a large population and a large population doesn't mean that you have to go and conquer all of the territories where people live in low populations, where people could live in low populations. every state system that developed through the many years for 5,000 years of the existence of states, every state system had on its edge peripheries where people would flee the state. People who weren't making the state would flee and go live in these small scale indigenous lifestyles. In the last few hundred years, we've closed those off. We've closed off this possibility. We have forcibly incorporated indigenous peoples living at these levels into our societies, and we have closed off the possibility that our own people might want to escape and move to this kind of society that and live this way like indigenous peoples. And there were people in the United States doing this, self-marooning, until very recently. The Great Dismal Swamp in southeast Virginia, northeast North Carolina, not far from where I'm sitting right now, was a refuge for people who didn't want to live in state society and could live in their own lifestyle. And it was drained. It was drained not because people thought it was environmentally good to drain the swamp. It was drained specifically because they wanted to get those people out of there and incorporate them into us. So I'm not talking about everybody all at once living in a stateless society. What I'm talking about is making good on our promise that when we converted from stateless societies to a state society, that it was going to be good for everyone. If we can't do that, we ought to restore the peripheries where people can go off and live in a small-scale version. But it's not that hard to create a system where we don't have this deep poverty and homelessness, where we have to eat other people's garbage to survive. I'm talking about getting rid of those things.
Was the creation of private property and concomitant rights to private property a necessary precondition for the modern state?
No, that's another myth. That's another myth that does get debunked in the course of this book and the next one. The project actually grew while we were writing it. We thought we'd maybe write an article, and then it became a book, and then we had too much to go in one book, so it's two books. The second book, which we're working on right now, is going to be called The Prehistory of Private Property. And it addresses some of the claims we didn't have room for in the first book to look at. And this book, in the course of the two books, we just debunk this idea that what Locke assumed is that people created property, private property, and then created the state to protect their private property, which gave private property a moral authority over any claims that the people or a collective or a government might have to property, and it is simply false. If you look at stateless societies, they do not have appropriated private property. They have group society property. And you find, if you look at the development of property, it does not begin, the development of what we now know as private property doesn't begin with these entrepreneurs or people appropriating property in the way Locke says. It begins with government kicking out indigenous peoples and then establishing it first as insider property for government officials. If you look at the kind of property that developed in Samaria or Egypt, you have insiders having this. And even in later ancient societies where you have conquering societies such as Rome or the British Empire or the US Empire, you have governments pretending that something like appropriation is happening, that people are just going out in the wilderness establishing property. But what's really happening is that the government is attacking indigenous communities or taking away traditional rights that people within the state had that were more collective. It's taking away these collective rights, and it is then giving it to some favored person and pretending that they have appropriated this property. That happened in Rome, that happened in the British Empire, that happened in the United States as we colonized the West. It is really not a matter of property comes first, then the state. It is the state comes first, and private property comes much, much later, very gradually developing out of what was a more collective system.
And it's also been used within not just the state, but the state sort of authorized functions like Robert Moses and the seizing of urban homes and the destruction of inner city neighborhoods. For example, 100 years ago, there was a thriving black middle class people don't really know about, and then came people like Robert Moses and just destroyed and made Harlem a ghetto in the bad sense of the term.
Oh yeah, a lot of people don't know the history of Robert Moses, and he was a really hugely influential person on where the United States is today. It is a car-dependent society. Where you have to use a car to get almost anywhere, and it is a ghettoized society. And he did a lot to create both. He's creating these highways so that people can come and go from city centers by cars, which is a horribly inefficient way to get people out of the city center. Public transit works much better. If you look at cities like London and Paris and Tokyo that have these options, it's a much better way to get in and out. But he didn't just do that. He strategically ran the highways through in a way that would cut off and ghettoize black neighbors. Well, first of all, they might just take the land. The land they were taking for the highway was usually the best land that was owned by non-whites. And then they'd use it to divide off, well, the blacks will be on this side of the highway, the whites will be safely on the other side of the highway, and the blacks will be very ghettoized. It was a really horrible thing. And that's a similar idea, but a more direct analogy to what I'm talking about would be in the enclosure movement in Britain, where you had these traditional rights of peasants on the land throughout the Middle Ages, where they had to pay tribute to the Lord. But other than that, the Lord largely let them alone, and they grew their crops, and they fed their animals, and they harvested, and they lived mostly on their own, except for having to pay tribute and obey the rules of the landlord. And they did this for most of the Middle Ages, and then gradually, starting with the Elizabethan period, really not completed until about the time Victoria takes the throne. Hundreds of years later, you have this gradual conversion of this traditional land rights into sole proprietorship of the owner. And then they'd say to the peasants, again, like the Lockean Proviso, they'd say, well, what you have isn't that valuable. I know your ancestors have lived on this spot for 1,000 years, but it's really not that valuable. I tell you what, you go to the city and you're going to get a job in the city, and you're going to like that better than what you have now. Now, a few generations later, that was true. Maybe the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of the people who went to the city were better off. But a lot of these people who lost their land and were forced into the city were worse off for the rest of their lives. They've never been compensated.
Let me bring up a term that's not really current in modern American society, and that's the public commons. And you've basically been describing that, and the things that you've been describing is the suppression of the idea of a public commons or a common weal not a necessary precondition, but is it something that's used strategically to disenfranchise individuals as well as groups?
I'm not sure what you mean by a commons weal or a public common.
Well, that we all have a common interest in, for example, to just give you a modern example, global warming, that the common weal of the United States should be to do everything to promote green solutions. We have this ring of plastic floating around the Pacific that we could create a lot of green jobs restoring the planet, but we don't want to restore the planet. We just want to frack and dig for more oil and coal and whatnot, rather than doing things that we know are for the public good.
Right. Well, we have it's an interesting. It's sort of an interesting good use, mid-use, and very often misuse of these ideas. We do need to talk about the general interest. Is that the general interest is extremely important, and that's what this social contract idea is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about we create a state, and the state is good for everyone, and it does these things we could not do for ourselves. And if you want to live at a large scale, as far as I know, there's no way to do that without a state apparatus. But very often, They will mislead you about what the state apparatus is, or what is good and bad about the state apparatus. What they usually do is favor insiders, whether it's a royal society, a feudal society, a communist society, or a welfare capitalist society like we have today. What little welfare of it is left is that governments very often end out to handing out favors to the wealthiest people in the name of benefiting everybody. And they're doing very much the wrong things. They'll say, we should be doing, we should be using tax funds to clean up this messy environment that we have. Instead, we're using those funds to subsidize airlines with free airports owned by the government. We're using it, and also a lot of other things we do for airlines. We're using it to subsidize automobile travel by giving free roads to the oil companies, the gas companies, and the tire companies are all getting all of this stuff for free. We're giving them free roads, free stoplights, and that is not being paid for out of what we're spending on tires, gas, and automobiles. And we claim this is in the general interest, but in fact, it's killing the very environment we live in. It's the opposite of the general interest. So what you're hitting on is the misuse of a very good idea. It's a very good idea for the government to work in the general interest. But what the government is very often doing is just using that as an excuse to help the wealthiest insiders. And we've got to change that.
Yeah, you could talk about big beef too, and a hamburger would cost 10 times what it does if we weren't subsidizing it. But I want to ask an anthropological question. I know you are the philosophy side, but in the book, a lot of it's mentioned. You mentioned Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes is famously known for the short, nasty, brutish life quote, and I think he also was famed for the red in tooth and claw. It might not have been Hobbes, but the idea that there's some nature, some evolved, now we'd call it genetic trait, that makes human beings, we still have this simian impulse to deceive, to connive, to hit the next monkey on the head with a bone if we don't get our way. How much of that factors into, I guess you call it the impulse for statehood, to control? I mean, is all governance an expression of, say, this simian need to control the other apes?
Well, there's some truth in that, is that every society has conflicts, and people lie and they cheat and they sometimes are aggressive, especially men. I suppose that's related to hormones or something, that men are doing this more than women. But you have these problems that develop, and you have to somehow protect yourself from people who are doing that, and also try to create a system in which people don't have an incentive to do that, to give them an incentive to not attack you and to behave decently towards you. That Hobbes said all of that, and there was, and Locke concurred, and there was really nothing wrong with all that. That was all. That is all true, but where his mistake was, where Hobbes' mistake was in that, is to say that the only solution is to have a king, a state, a sovereign, to have some final arbiter of all disputes, who makes the rules, adjudicates disputes, and has the power to enforce his or her, it could be, decisions. So that's what Hobbes thought that was the only solution. But he did not look at evidence to see if there were other solutions out there, or to see how well his solution played up. His idea was, you have this hierarchy. We all know what the hierarchy is, and the person at the top can enforce the hierarchy, and then there won't be any conflicts, because the one person at the top always does it. But what actually usually happens in these things is, it's like the Game of Thrones, is that I think that series has a very good point. The point of that series, as far as I can understand, is that this idea of one person at the top is a horrible system, because people are always fighting to be that one guy at the top. It doesn't work that well. Democracy works better. But there are other things outside of democracy that he didn't even look at. The way stateless societies do it is with largely a lot of different things. They'll ridicule somebody that's putting other people down. They will uh, they will they will tell a person, if you're going to camp with us, you got to do things our way, and they will leave a group. They will leave a person who is leading the group, who is trying to be domineering or something like that. And this is the power that our societies do not give to normal individuals. A very wealthy person can say, okay, you want me to obey these rules, and I'm going to stop working. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to work to promote your system. I'll just live off my assets and do it that way. Powerful people have this right of non-cooperation, or power of non-cooperation. But the rest of us don't. The rest of us don't, because the resources are owned by everyone else.
Yeah.
In stateless society, the resources are available. If you don't like the way the group is doing it, you just go out and do it. You do it your own way with whoever might want to go with you. In our society, you try to do that, you'll be arrested for trespassing, or you'll find you don't have any resources and you're starving until you have to actually do consent to do what other people tell you, or you'll live at a horrible level where you're eating other people's garbage and living in public parks and things like that. And some people do get by doing it that way, but it is not a real option to say, I'm not going to accept this inequality and this is the way you're doing things. That is a power that we need to concede to normal people in our countries.
2 points regarding Hobbes. Number one, just to sort of play devil's advocate, is it really fair to ding Hobbes for his, I mean, he lived in the 17th century, correct? He didn't have access to all the resources we do now to collate the ways different societies function. He was in a European model, and they didn't even really know that much about, Asian or American or African society. And number two, then if you could segue into the Hobbesian hypothesis, since that's one of the bedrock points of the book. So one about Hobbes himself, and then the hypothesis.
Yeah. So the in that sense, I don't fault him for what he doesn't know, but I do, and I don't have to fault him in any sense as a bad person. I never met him. He's probably a decent guy. He lived to 90, and probably had a good family and stuff like that. I'm not saying Hobbes is a bad guy. And now his mistake, but he made a mistake that is really, really common, that we all need to learn, is that he didn't have enough information to make the conclusion. He didn't know things, and he pretended he knew them. He thought he knew about what indigenous peoples all around the world, anybody without a king or some kind of government to keep the peace, he thought he knew exactly what they were like. He got that from two sources, from the colonial reports of people who are going to the colonies, conquering land, and then complaining that the indigenous people fought back and declaring them to be warlike savages, when in fact we were the aggressors. Our ancestors were the aggressors. Now, so he believed that, but he also used this a priori reasoning, which was pretty faulty as well, that for various reasons, if there wasn't a peacekeeper at the very top, then you would have this sort of chaos. He pretended he knew that when he didn't. You find Plato and Aristotle doing the same thing. You have lots of people throughout history, whether they're scientists or philosophers or politicians or ordinary people, they think they know something when we don't. When they don't. We all make mistakes. But we've got to get these mistakes out of our theory. His big mistake was not saying that, you can have a state if it makes people better off. His mistake was the factual thing it said, yes. When he said, the full quote was, without a government, blah, 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 all these bad things that can happen. And he ends it with, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's what he claimed it would be like if we didn't have a state, and it was false. And that allowed him, if you think that all those poor people on the street, when you pass them, if we didn't have our property rights system and our state system, would all be naked savages killing each other, it's easier for you to tell yourself, I don't have to help these people. They're already helped. They're not as better off as me, but they're not. But if you find out that they're actually living better off in these sorts of societies, you need to do something. And that's what I call the Hobbesian hypothesis. This belief that the Lockean proviso is built. We give ourselves a standard. We've got to justify the state and the property rights system by having them be good for everyone. Then we simply lie to ourselves and say, well, in fact, they are better off. When we have no evidence, it's a destructive myth, it's a paleo fantasy. We have to work hard to make sure that the least advantaged among us are, in fact, benefiting from the institutions that we impose on.
Let me just pick up on a term you used, the Lockean proviso. What is that? And you also use a term throughout the book, and this is just for people who may not know, original contract. What are those two terms, and how are they central to some of your theses?
Well, okay, definition. The Lockean proviso is a moral principle where you can impose an institution on people as long as it makes them better off. You don't have to get everyone's consent, because you'll never get everyone's consent to anything. We can't even have a rule outlawing murder and have a ballot initiative on that and get 100% people agreeing. There'd be some joker who's just going to say, no, I don't want to I don't want to ban murder. I'm going to vote against this. Someone will do that. So the idea of a Lockean proviso is that you can impose an institution, even if not everybody agrees, as long as it doesn't harm them, it makes them better off. And this idea, even though the term is much later, this idea is both in Lockean property theory, where it's okay to appropriate property as long as no one's harmed, and Hobbesian justification of the state, where it says it's okay to impose a state, even without getting the people's consent, as long as it makes them better off. Now, he goes so far as to say in fact, if they understand that it makes them better off, they will, in fact, tacitly consent, but that's not so important. Now, the other one that you were asking is social contract. That is what Hobbes is talking about when he says social contract. Social contract is this imagined agreement where in the state of nature, we're all worse off, so we all agree to establish the state, which supposedly is the only way to make us better off. And we then have signed a contract, and we are then morally obliged to obey the state because it has fulfilled this Lockean proviso, because the Hobbesian hypothesis is supposedly true, and therefore if we understood the kind of agreement that it takes to create a society, we would all sign on to it. Every single one of us would if we truly understood it, supposedly. That's the social contract. And the social contract has been the central justification of the state for the last 350 years, because it makes everyone better off. Now, and a lot of people have made that same mistake Hobbes did, that says we've already done everything that we need to do to make everyone better off, so the social contract is fulfilled. There have been skeptics, people like Thomas Paine, like Henry George, like Peter Kropotkin, like contemporary people such as Alan Ryan, Carol Pateman, Charles Mills, and many others have been skeptical about this idea. But if you got to go back to Peter Kropotkin, to find somebody that's actually doing quite a bit of empirical research to say this is false.
One other thing to end the segment, John Locke also, it brings up the idea of natural law. What is natural law, and how does that work into this model of the state?
Well, Hobbes and Locke actually originated, well, I guess they didn't originate them, but they are sort of the modern exemplars of these two ideas. Hobbes thinks that all law flows from the social contract, all moral law flows from the social contract. That there's simply, if you're a naked savage, starving, there's no law, morality doesn't apply to you. Morality is just obeying your society's social contract for Hobbes. That all of these rules are socially created, but for Hobbes at least, they're nevertheless morally binding. Now for Locke comes to this idea that there is law in the absence of the state, before the state, no matter what the state says, there are moral principles that must be obeyed. Now, most religious people would agree with it, and Locke was very Christian. The idea of natural law actually goes back to Thomas Aquinas, who was writing hundreds of years earlier, and he gets it from biblical and ancient sources. So it's not a new idea. But what Locke is saying with natural law is that there are some things that are right and wrong, regardless of what the state does, and actually with preeminence, before the state. And some of these, like, you shouldn't murder your brothers and sisters. Other human beings should not be murdered. I think most of us would accept that that's a natural law. That's not just some social contrivance. On that issue, I think Locke is right. If a government proposes rules that don't protect my life, it's a government that is trampling on natural law, my natural rights. But Locke works in a bunch of natural laws that I don't think are so natural. He thought they were so natural. And often, natural law, not just by Locke, but by people throughout history, have been using it to justify privilege. In the Middle Age, people justified the powers of kings and dukes and earls and all the upper class with some idea that these privileges of these class were natural law. Locke does the biggest job of transforming that idea as a justification not of people with lordly titles, but with private property owners. Just saying that there's a natural right to go out and privatize property. And some of us did it and some didn't. And if you're born in a society where you own nothing and other kids are born as billionaires, that's a natural right. You cannot naturally go against them without going against the way people naturally appropriate property. And there is no truth in that. People do not naturally go out and appropriate private property. If you look at societies that are establishing a group goes into an area, let's make sure we all get some. We all have access to these resources together. So natural law, as Locke gets into it, natural law itself is a good idea, but it can be misused when it's used to justify privileges that aren't in any way natural.
It seems that the book posits both Locke and Hobbes as sort of the two sort of twin towers of the idea of the state, or founding fathers, if you will. And it seems that the book, and you are making the argument that they had the idea of either a state society or a stateless society. But there are different types of states, and they both lived pre-socialism, pre-communism. Do you think that they were wedded to the idea of the private property capitalist model? How do you think they would have viewed modern states that don't follow that model?
Well, Hobbes is an interesting guy because his whole thing is follow whatever state exists. Because he lived through the Civil War, and I guess his personal experience with the English Civil War in the 1600s was so horrible that he thought any state is better than this chaos. Now, so he's basically saying, if King Charles I is in power, obey him. Don't overthrow him. If he gets overthrown and Oliver Cromwell is now the dictator, follow him. And if Oliver Cromwell gets overthrown and then we have King Charles's son or nephew or whoever it was, if we have him in power, follow him. Follow the one person at the top, no matter what it is they're saying, and that's just so much better than being a naked savage or being someone in a state. So
Hitler would have loved Hobbes.
What's that?
Hitler would have loved Hobbes.
Yeah. Also, I think Louis XIV and XV, where they basically he was like he was well before them, but those are the type of people he would like. But anybody really, Hitler, Stalin, whatever, just do what the top guy says. So Hobbes wouldn't have any problem with this or that or the other thing. Now Locke, in that sense, Locke's writing 50 years later, and he is, I think, in that sense, I don't know, more sophisticated or more humane or what the word is for it, but he doesn't say follow any state. He does use Hobbesian social contract theory, which is the state is justified if and when it makes people better off. But what he says is that you have these natural rights that don't exist for Hobbes. You have these natural rights, and you would only sign a social contract to obey the state if it protected your natural rights. So if there are no so if the natural rights, so as long as the state is obeying your natural rights, then it's worth following. It's worth obeying the state if it's protecting those natural rights. Now, that's a good idea. I think that Lockean perspective on the social contract is better than the Hobbesian perspective, that these social rights need to be, these natural rights need to be incorporated into the Lockean proviso, or whatever we need the state to do to justify itself. But those rights are as good or bad as the person who states them, and he works it out so that that wealthy people have lots and lots of rights, and the rest of us have little other right than to work for them or get some charity if we're unable to work for people who are better off. And so he cooks the books when he writes those, and when he creates those rights in ways that I think are morally objectionable. Now, everyone who has a natural rights theory does that. I mean, I suppose I do that too. You know, is that I think these are the things that are important to us as individuals, and not everybody's going to agree with me. So the extent to which you're going to follow Locke's list of natural rights, or my list of natural rights, or anybody else's, is going to be, well, how good do you think those rights are? How important are those to me in my life? And we're not going to completely agree on those. That creates a problem with creating a state. And that problem I want to wrestle with in my theories is, like, how do we wrestle the problem when we have inherent disagreement about whether the state is or is not justifying my rights as I perceive them myself.
I want to return to the anthropological side of things, and again, I know you're not the anthropologist that wrote the
That's okay,
book,
because I've read a lot of anthropology.
Okay.
I just counted this up the other day, and I earned being able to work with Grant McCall because I did a lot of reading on anthropology of my own before we found each other, and I have 492 pages of anthropology notes. Not just whatever. That's my notes from what I've read. So I do know a little something about anthropology. So
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to bring up Steven Pinker, since he's mentioned later on in the book, and the whole idea. If we go back to these ideas dating back a few hundred years, especially with the conquest of the Americas, came the idea of the noble savage, really. And Steven Pinker, in the last 15, 20 years, has written a few books that sort of debunk that kind of idea. And whatever you think of Pinker and his research, there seems to be little doubt, for example, that the death or the extinction of the Ice Age megafauna, especially of the Americas, seems to have an eerie coincidence with the arrival of the later human hunters after the last ice went away. That within 100 or 200 years of the arrival of humans in a certain area, a lot of the indigenous species were wiped out by these invaders from Asia, known as man. So what is your idea on the idea of the noble savage, number one, and Pinker's research into it?
Okay, that's a long question.
Okay.
First of all, the noble savage was actually not invented by Rousseau or people that wanted to say nice things about indigenous peoples. And Rousseau actually he wasn't that nice towards indigenous peoples, as people often say. Is that it wasn't invented by anybody who wanted to say nice things about indigenous people, but it was invented by racists who wanted to discredit anybody who said anything nice about indigenous peoples. Like, oh, you are romanticizing the noble savage. When and the idea is it's supposed to be an oxymoron. It's that you can't be both. Noble is the person who has all the highest qualities of civilization. A savage is a person who lacks all of those qualities. So it's made to be self-contradictory. We can throw this label on people and say, oh, you're romanticizing the noble savage, and then that discredits what they say. And this is also not based on evidence. But ideas like this, and ideas that Rousseau at least literally said, he might have been talking metaphorically in the stuff that he wrote, but I don't know what he said, is that we want to believe, for some reason, for many, many years, hundreds of years, we wanted to believe that indigenous peoples or people in the deep past were very different from us. That either they were all these violent savages, or that they were these innocent people who knew nothing of violence and knew nothing of this, that, and the other thing, and lived in harmony with their environment or something like this. For some reason, people have wanted to believe these things. And the truth is that as long as there have been people like us, which is about 200,000 years, and some of our hominin ancestors might have been pretty similar for hundreds of thousands of years before that, they've dealt with the kind of things we deal like. They're imperfect people. They don't know what it means to be in tune with the environment. No animal does. Some animals have a niche, and so they are in tune with their environment, not because they're trying, just because they've evolved into this niche. We are like an invasive species. We developed all these abilities, and we didn't realize that these give us a lot of advantages over other species, but it also makes us an invasive species all around the world. And we're doing things that alter the environment for every other species on this earth. And as far as I know, it could be killing this planet. I often wonder, the big question here is, are humans smarter than yeast? You put yeast and alcohol, and it will just breed and consume alcohol. Put it in malt. Breed and consume until it excretes so much alcohol that it all dies of suffocation.
Well, I also read that human beings could be the most destructive species since the formation of oxygen-breathing animals, the oxygen apocalypse of 1 billion or so years ago.
Oh yeah, I think that's true. And the thing is, we're the only species. When those oxygen breathing microbes or plants came along, they didn't know what kind of harm they were doing. They couldn't look at the environment and say, "Wow, we're changing it." We are looking at an environment where we're killing it. We're killing it with plastics. We're killing it with global warming. We're killing it with Fukushima's nuclear waste coming out year after year. Could be poisoning all life in the Pacific. We're killing it with loss of habitat, and we'll look this in the face and say, "Oh, no problems, everything's fine." And we've been possibly doing this in some way for tens of thousands of years. When you bring up the extinction of the megafauna, things like the woolly mammoth and things like the saber-toothed tiger, but also things that you rarely hear about, like the giant bears and giant elk and giant moose. Now, there's one theory. There's a blitzkrieg. The blitzkrieg theory is that most of these species, most of these megafauna, and megafauna just means a species that's larger than humans. Most of these are extinct everywhere but Africa. And Africa and maybe southern Asia, you've got rhinos and elephants and a few in Africa that survived. You've got things like polar bears, but they're really remote regions. Most of these, you say, when people got there, these disappeared about the time that people got there. Now, there's a blitzkrieg theory that's been going around for a while and saying, look, this is probably hunting. It's probably people going into these areas, and unlike the rhino and the hippopotamus, they're not evolved to fight off humans or to coexist with them the way giraffes and And elephants are. They're totally not evolved. They're easy prey for smart species like humans. So we go and we hunt them all off. That's why we have more megafauna in Africa than everywhere else. Now, that is, I am inclined to believe that's a big part of the explanation. My co-author, Grant, thinks that it might be other factors. It might be more to do with loss of habitat, and it might be more to do with things like climate change, because the climate was changing in a big way at about the time that humans were going to all these places as well. So it could be climate change, could be loss of habitat, but we're responsible for the loss of habitat too. It could be overhunting. We know of at least a couple of megafauna examples where it was definitely overhunting. The stellar sea cow in northeastern Asia was hunted to death in the 1800s by explorers, and the moa in in uh, New Zealand was hunted to death by the Maori, who took their name from, as Maori means Moa hunter. So we know that this megafauna extinction has sometimes been caused by us. So I think probably at other times it's been caused by humans too. And this dispels the idea that early humans somehow were more in tune to their environment than we are. They weren't more in tune with it. It's just they hadn't developed all the ways to destroy it that we are. Yeah. We're actually much better placed to understand the damage we're doing to the environment than one of the first Native Americans was 15,000 years ago when they were coming to America and hunting the giant elk or the giant moose or the woolly mammoths or whatever. We're much more in tune with our environment in the sense of understanding it. The thing is, they've got an excuse. Their excuse is not that they were in tune with their environment. Their excuse is they didn't know any better. They didn't know they were killing the environment. We know that we're doing it, and we're still not doing it, and that is pretty horrific. Now, that doesn't connect so much with Steven Pinker. If you want me to talk about Steven Pinker.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, now, so Steven Pinker has written this book about why violence has declined. And he's got great evidence to show that violence has significantly and tremendously declined in the last 500 years. And his theory of why it happens is if you create a society where people don't fear violence, then they don't feel the need to commit violence as much. And when you put down violence, when it comes up, then you can help to create this. And we've been doing better and better at establishing societies where people don't face day-to-day environment. With all of the horrible wars of the last 100 years and the terrorism and the crime and everything else, actually the last 100 years have been some of the most peaceful in human history. All of those wars don't add up on a per capita basis to being what it was 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years. That Pinker is correct about all of it. But what he's wrong about is to credit this with he credits Hobbes. Hobbes' solution. He thinks this is because we have a state. It's not because we have a state. States commit lots of violence. States start wars. 500 years ago, all of those societies he's talking about 500 years ago were state societies run by states, and they were horribly violent. And if you look at his data going back earlier than 500 years is terrible data. He doesn't have any evidence that states 500, he assumes that he's got a trend. He sees a trend where it's getting more and more violent for 500 years, and he extrapolates that to 5,000 years or 50,000 years. And you cannot extrapolate that. Actually, if you look at stateless societies, they are, some of them are less violent than our societies today. Others are more violent, but very few of them are as violent as state societies were 500 years ago. So it's not the state. He's got great evidence. He should have just started 500 years ago and not trying to extrapolate to this using Hobbes' poor theory to something that happened 5,000 years ago, he has very minimal evidence.
So that's where you would leave it off, say that there just isn't enough known about you know, life in the BC era or life even in the first millennium to make those claims.
Oh no, actually, we do know something about it. We have evidence about life expectancy and possibility of violent death from looking at graves and looking at this. You can look at graves. You can look at graves from Sweden and Britain from like the 1700s and find out that people were dying just as young as people were 10,000 years ago when they were hunter gatherers. You can look at this kind of evidence and you find out that and you can look at ethnographic evidence where people go and live with indigenous societies and learn their ways. And ethnographic evidence on violence is really interesting because there's not enough of it. We can't really know. If you just take all of the stateless societies and average them, you will get the ones that have been ethnographically observed. You will get, and this is combining really very, very different societies living at different scales. You get what we have in the book is, I think it's something about a homicide rate of 40,000. 40 per year out of every 100,000 people. That is a lot more than in our state societies today, but it's a lot lower than Honduras. It's a lot lower than Yemen. It's a lot lower than many past state societies. And so you also get a really wide variance. You find some stateless societies where you've got 1,000 people, per 1,000 dying per year. And you want to find that in modern terms, you got to go to wartime. Wartime, you'll get that. During the Irish potato famine, you got that. Most of the time, you don't. But you will get others that have a really low one. And societies where it's a society of only 50 or 100 people, and either they have no memory of somebody getting killed, or they have, somebody was killed here 20 years ago. Well, if you extrapolate 20 years ago on a society of 100 people, that's actually a fairly high murder rate, but it's not, there's been one murder that in my society for 20 years. I probably feel a lot safer walking down the path in that society than I would walking down the street in Detroit, Michigan right now. Or New Orleans or Chicago, one of the cities that's more violent right now. So it is not true that we need this state apparatus in order to protect us, and it's not true that the states are fulfilling their promise to protect us from violence. A lot of our states are failing in this, and we're failing in the biggest ways for the people that live in our inner cities, and our ghettos, and our Native American reservations. The people we're failing most in the United States.
I want to just wrap up this segment, and then we'll wrap up in a final segment about going forward with other theses that you're going to be working on. I just want to make 2 points regarding the invasive nature of humanity. One was there have been, I know in Alberta, findings of mass drivings of bison over cliffs to go back 10,000 or more years. And so it's interesting to know that a lot of what we consider modern techniques of hunting that was used, say, to kill off the buffalo here in North America 100 or so years ago, were being used by Native Americans thousands of years ago. But the other thing, too, is a lot of the megafauna reproduce very slowly because they're large animals. And it just takes the killing or the culling of one extra male per year to within a generation or so, that whole species declines in a specific area. So it's basically that it's accidental. Just the need for humans to survive sometimes could be the end of another species. So I just wanted to make that point. If you have a comment on that.
It is. We don't know. We don't have a good idea of what is a sustainable amount of hunting or fishing or almost any kind of foraging to do. We found that, in hundreds of thousands of years of humans foraging, they can sustainably provide their dinner, but they weren't necessarily sustainably treating each species. They certainly, we know that indigenous peoples hunted the moa to death. Probably they did the same with all this megafauna in North America and other places, and people didn't realize how few it takes to kill that. But we've done that in the modern world. We hunted the passenger pigeon to extinction. We have hunted a lot of local species to extinction. And when you're combining hunting with loss of habitat, it's a double whammy, and it just only takes a little bit. And sometimes you don't notice because you have something like a long-lived species. Sturgeon are extinct from a lot of rivers. They're not extinct from North America, but you found that when you look at sturgeon, you only find old sturgeon because sturgeon lived to be 50, 100 years old. And you're finding these like 50-year-old sturgeon, but no young ones. We have done something to keep them from reproducing. So it's very possible that we already put into place things that are going to cause the sturgeon and many other species to become extinct. Not to mention the type of overfishing we're doing. We almost did that. Well, we did that with several whale species. And we stopped whaling, but how many species are going to recover and how many aren't, I don't know. And we could be doing it with really all kinds of species right now. We want more and more fish, and it's just not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, the zombie species. Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy is the name of the book. Is the problem the idea of myths, in a sense? I mean, do we have modern political myths that are as pernicious as those that you describe in a prehistoric sense?
Well, the important thing to note is I actually wish I had thought of this, of putting it this way before we finish the book, but I'm just going to put it this way now, is that not all myths are bad. Myths are bad if myths are good if they tell a greater truth. Myths are bad if they get you to believe a lie. That's a destructive myth. A good myth would be something like, if you take the Adam and Eve story, can be a really beautiful story and a great lesson, which is that we're all born, if you look at it as a metaphor, they were all born into innocence. We don't know right from wrong, and then therefore we can't do wrong. And everything is provided for us. Our parents feed us. We have no worries, no cares. We don't have to toil. We don't have to give birth. All these nice things we can do in an innocent childhood. But we grow up, and as we grow up, we learn right from wrong. And when we learn right from wrong, we inevitably choose to do the wrong thing sometimes. And then the Christian goes on, this gives you the need for forgiveness. And that is a really good story. This is how we grow up, and we do need to seek some sort of forgiveness or restitution for what we do wrong. But if you say there's a lot of ways you can make a destructive myth out of that, you can say, well, it's all Eve's fault. The problem here is that Adam trusted Eve when she brought him that stuff. If men just don't trust women, then everything's fine. That's a destructive myth. It's destructive because the metaphor behind it is false. So a myth is as good as the greater truth it reveals. Now, the idea that we need a Lockean proviso is a good idea, that you shouldn't impose a state or a property rights system unless it's going to make everybody off. That's a great moral principle. But the destructive myth is just, let's just tell ourselves that it always and everywhere makes people better off. Then we can treat the disadvantaged people in our societies horribly and pretend that they're benefiting from what we're doing. And we can go and conquer the lands and forcibly incorporate the indigenous, and they'll be better off. That is a destructive myth. So what I'm worried about here is destructive myths, but myths can be very good. Now you were asking, what was the other part of your question?
Well, do we need myths? But let me ask about here in the 21st century, since we're dealing with global warming. Is the modern state model, in a sense, responsible for the capitalistic, say, state model? Is that responsible largely, do you think, for the global warming crisis that we have? And would would a stateless model or another type of state model have served better and have us in a better position now, do you think, than we are in?
Well, I'm a very radical supporter of democracy. Is that you need power to the people. It's not specifically capitalism, but it is privilege-based society. And virtually all society, whether Soviet communism, American capitalism, Chinese imperial system, European feudalism, are all societies of privilege, where they look at usually the short-term interest of the privilege. Now, we got to have a society. We got to create some sort of a society that is that that is based on true equality of people, that the interests of everyone matters equally. Because you're a billionaire or you're a political insider, you don't matter anymore. We shouldn't maybe give people control over so many resources that they can be called a billionaire. That we're going to make sure that society really does work in the interest of everyone, and that we also then, this society then has to take a responsibility that we have a responsibility to future generations. Now, we wouldn't if nobody was going to have kids. If we all decided, okay, party time, no more children, everybody's going to get sterilized, and this is going to be the last generation on Earth, and then, okay, we can destroy the environment all we want. If we're doing it that way, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to have kids, and it's nice to have kids. People like to have kids. Kids like being born once they're alive, usually. We want to pass it on to future generations. Then, since we know this is the reality, that we have to take future generations into account. So it's not enough just to have a society that is a democracy that really creates institutions that makes everyone equally weighed in its decision making. But these individuals have to take responsibility that we are fiduciaries for the future generations.
Are we fiduciaries for non-humans as well? Would Locke approve? Would Locke have approved of your party like it's 1999, burn the planet and take every living creature with us?
I'm not sure if Locke would approve that. I don't approve. I think I don't necessarily think that animals. I don't know whether animals have a right to go on living. I haven't really gotten into that issue. They certainly have. They certainly have the right not to be treated cruelly, not to be caused pain by us. But the thing is, you don't need a concept of animal rights or plant rights or environmental rights to tell us that we need to treat animals, plants, and the environment better. Even if you make what I think is the rather extreme act, that these things only exist for our benefit, we're killing them, and they're not going to benefit us anymore. Yeah. We need to have a sustainable environment, if for nothing else, but for the good of humans. Now, I do think that it does have value on its own, but I don't want to try to convert everybody to that. I think I can convert them to the simpler idea that we're killing the environment that sustains us, and that's a big reason to change just about everything we're doing environment. So I don't want to get into that argument about animal and environmental rights, even though it might well be sound.
Finally, what is you said that you are working? Are you working alone on a follow-up book, or are you working with Grant McCall? And what is the baton that's being handed off to the next book?
Well, I'm working on several things at once, as I often end up doing. But the big project right now is the sequel to this book by Grant and I. Is Grant and me. The first book focused on myths connected to this Lockean proviso and Hobbesian hypothesis that the proviso was fulfilled. The second book debunks this idea of appropriation and the natural right of property, that somehow individuals naturally create private property. And if collectives interfere with that, or if governments interfere with that, then they are trampling on someone's natural rights. The exact opposite is true. Over the history and the development of private property, it has started out with collective, small scale, very small scale collective, but still collective control of property. And then either it develops into a larger scale society where a king gets control of it and it's his property, and then he doles it out to his underlings, and it's usually he. Or you get colonialism from a state like that that goes out and attacks these states with these more collectivist institutions. It takes government power and military interference with indigenous peoples to establish private property rights. Private property is nothing natural about a right to private property. People were very good about, people in indigenous societies are certainly not perfect, but one thing we're good about is sharing out resources. Now, that's one part of the book. Another part looks at this argument that capitalism is the freest society possible in the sense of negative freedom, and we argue that that is completely false. And an idea that equality is impossible, that you can't have a more equal society, or at least not without sacrificing freedom. And we show that anthropologically and historically, all of these claims are false. And we call the book The Prehistory of Private Property. We're making great progress on it now, and I think it'll be out next year.
I want to just ask one final question, but I'll do that. I will link to your university page where anyone can contact you there. And I want to ask a question that really isn't specific to the book that we've discussed or the one that you're writing. And this is one that is just, I want to hear your opinion on, since we've now done 2 shows together, and I'm just interested in your personal opinion. It astounds me sometimes as an American how tone deaf America is to how it's perceived around the world. We talk about a war on terror, yet one can make a good argument that America has brought more destruction to the world, say, since the fall of communism than any other country. Some might even say since the end of World War II, although the Maoist travesties and Stalin was still around in the early part there. Do you view, say, existentially, U.S. American ambitions as the biggest existential threat to humanity, especially, well, should I say American, the one percenters, as they call them?
I don't know about the biggest. I'm very bad at superlatives. There are so many existential threats to humanity at this time. That is one very big one. Yeah, so I agree with you. Yeah, that's a very substantial threat. And America's ignorance about the rest of the world, which is fueled by it's fueled by how isolated we are. We've got mostly desert separating us from Mexico, and then we've got Canada, which isn't all that different from the United States culturally speaking, and isn't that big. And then we got these huge oceans. So the United States has, since the founding of the European colony, since it's has been able to think of itself in isolation, then one day it becomes so powerful that it's going out and it's a major player in the world. From World War I on, it becomes a major player, but we never bothered to learn about this world. Now we can ignore it, not only because we're isolated, but also because we're so powerful. So we got 2 reasons to ignore other countries around the world, not learn about them, and that ignorance. Most of the evil that the United States does comes from that ignorance. We're doing things that don't work. But I don't think anybody in the United States in any significant way benefited from our invasion of Iraq. It was not some master plan for the Bush administration to further their interests in the world. Some companies got a lot of money out of it. Companies get money from the government all the time. If they wanted to buy stuff from Blackwater, they could have bought plenty of stuff from Blackwater without going to war with them. It was a dumb idea out of the ignorance of George Bush and many of the other people who were making these decisions. And we've done, overthrowing the Shah of Iran was just as ignorant. That was way back, was that the Truman or the Eisenhower administration?
In the 40s, I think.
Way back then, one ignorant thing after another, and really evil things. Just thinking, well, we're always the right guys, and we don't have to pay attention to what's going on in. The establishment of the Shah. Did I say establishment or overthrow? The establishment of the Shah back I might have said overthrow. The who was the guy before him? Anyway, that our ignorance is a huge threat to ourselves. People who don't understand the world and make decisions about the world are going to bring themselves to grief.
Yeah.
And our power has let us get away with making a lot of these huge mistakes that harm us and harm the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And all this is coming back on us sooner or later.
Yeah, it's like America. It was a petulant only child and didn't have siblings
Yeah.
around. And if someone from South America uses a term like ugly American, like, what, you don't love me? It's like,
Yeah.
don't you? It's like I said, it's what toned it. We're not only ignorant, we're willfully ignorant, it seems.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was good talking to you again. And as I said, I will link to your university page. So, Carl Whitequist, thank you for your time.